If you honestly got confused judging of how the title of this video is really off-putting when it comes to a character dealing with a day ending with disaster, while the other episode, which is longer than this, had everything to do with bad luck, which is similar to No Such Luck. Let me tell you, these two episodes are way more similar to each other than you actually thought. Granted, when it comes to cost, it tries a lot to be a lot more different compared to Raw Deal, but at the same time, with one of the main characters is taking something a lot more seriously, is literally the same way as Lincoln did in Raw Deal. The only difference is that in Raw Deal, Lincoln's character of being paranoid has been carried on to the point that I'm starting to convince that he still has that persona to this day. In Raw Deal, after picking out a card by the fortune teller Lucy, she told to Lincoln that his day would end in disaster, while in the Casagrandes episode, Rosa is thrilled to meet Ernesto in Great Lake City, but unfortunately, he wasn't available because of a thing that he has on his face that I have to admit it's really stupid, but at the same time, for how this episode is executed, it honestly didn't bother me completely. Because once we figure out that the reason onto why Rosa is taking her family to different places in the second half of this episode is because after Ernesto stated that Great Lake City had bad luck, Rosa believes him. I need to make one thing perfectly clear because I've seen people complain about this as one of the biggest problems of Rosa's character. But let's get back to the Loud House episode where the majority of the episode centers around Lincoln preventing anything bad happening to him, while his sisters and parents are enjoying their day. In all honesty, when people say that this is a Lincoln torture episode, it's not really. In fact, none of Lincoln's sisters do anything bad towards Lincoln in this episode, which is saying something considering that this is a Season 1 episode. If anything, one of the reasons onto why the sisters aren't doing anything to help out Lincoln is because the fact that Lucy is mostly the odd one out of the bunch, which is actually a lot more convincing when you realize that in the Season 2 episode, Lucy wants to have things for herself just as much as the other characters do, but considering that she can't be able to do anything because no one can listen or see her completely, it kind of makes sense onto why people just don't usually believe Lincoln's scenario, except when it comes to Lisa, who thinks otherwise. When it comes to the Casagrandes episode, regardless if the characters are trying everything to convince their grandmother that there is no bad luck whatsoever or any bad luck can happen anywhere, it's not in the same way as in the Greenhouse and the Power Play episodes where the characters were likable or completely unlikable, because in this scenario, they are mostly close to each other a lot more, which is honestly saying a lot, knowing full well that in Raw Deal, it kind of shows that the characters just aren't as close as each other when they're in some scenarios where they're going on a road trip. Like, I understand that the Casagrandes may be a mixed bag when it comes to their relationships with each other's, but whenever I completely look at this episode where the characters are trying to convince their grandmother that bad luck can happen anywhere, they just want to give their grandmother something to understand that they shouldn't count on fortune tellers. But if they were taking a different route of just completely lashing out on Rosa that fortune tellers are fake, then this would have been a lot more similar to "Oh, are you for real?" from the Loud House episode from season 3, so from season 2. When it comes to Lucy, even though that she's only doing this for her own entertainment, you need to understand that what ends up happening with the Loud siblings, it's mainly out of random luck or just a weird coincidence to them. Which is why that this episode being grounded in reality somewhat works, and to give the Casagrandes episode credit, even though that there were a few incidents that had been over the top when it comes to the fantasy elements, the Coast episode was actually grounded in reality, in the same scenario as this episode. And most of the stuff that ends up happening in Raw Deal is honestly a random coincidence that convinces Lincoln that nothing bad is going to happen, which is why that his day was really one of the worst days that he had, or just probably one of the most exhausting days that he had, because he honestly thought that his day would end up in disaster because he believed UC. But before I get back to the Casagrandes episode, let's talk about Lincoln. Compared to how he's portrayed as the series progressed and how this episode aged, it goes to show that he can instantly be mostly too listening and too understanding of what people are saying to him. Like, the friends in dry places is an indication that his paranoia is just getting the best of him, and his derailment is just causing a lot more problems than honestly making his paranoia anything but showcasing of the people he should trust the most. And when it comes to this episode, it's honestly a lot more difficult to take itself seriously after watching more episodes from this show. Like, it's somewhat relatable considering that if you're Lincoln's age, you will probably believe something from the other person even though what they're saying isn't completely true. But knowing how difficult it is that Lincoln's paranoid persona ended up carrying on as the series progressed, I honestly felt like that his paranoia is honestly something that is stuck to his character completely. And whenever anything happens in this episode after rewatching it, it's not as impressive as it was, knowing full well that once you see all the problems in the later seasons of The Loud House, you just look at this episode and just think, in all honesty, what would this episode would have been like if Lincoln didn't believe anything that Lucy had stated, and the bad stuff actually happens to him. Because I don't even know if they didn't want Lincoln to be hateable or likable when it comes to this scenario, but at the same time, compared to how the series progressed and how the characters got derailment, it's honestly difficult of what choices Lincoln would have made if he believed or not believed Lucy's fortune telling. When it comes to Rosa believing in Ernesto, I understand why people didn't like this. It was getting repetitive and it just made Rosa completely difficult to take herself seriously completely. Like, in some occasions it makes sense that she's just trying to be overprotective, but the thing is, Rosa is the only parent in this entire show that is taking her job seriously as a parent. Granted, it's overprotective, and I understand that the other parents in this show and in the Loud House can do better, but whenever I see Rosa believing in Ernesto, regardless if Ernesto is a fortune teller that shouldn't be taken seriously, none of the parents aren't taking their parenting skills seriously as much as Rosa, considering that they don't do much in this episode. In other episodes, they don't even do much considering that they're basically tagging along with the child characters and mostly the teens. And whenever I completely look at this episode, it honestly feels like that the reason why they're not doing anything to stop Rosa is because they instantly don't know what it feels like to be overprotective. Like, Maria would have had more development if there was at least more episodes dedicated to her. And the same thing can apply to the other characters that do take the parenting jobs seriously. But when they're instantly just allowing Rosa to do anything because she can intimidate them a lot more, then I honestly felt like that the parenting skills involving the other characters are just being toned down because they're not taking their job seriously. If you ask me, I would understand that they're supposed to be comedic, but at the same time, compared to the other appearances that have done a lot more worse, that doesn't automatically mean that these characters are excusable for how they're portrayed. It's honestly one thing to understand that rooting for the characters for their own goals is one thing, but when you have an episode that centers around one parent who is the grandmother of the entire family being the only parent that is taking it seriously while the other characters aren't, then I honestly don't know what to expect, because if this entire episode didn't happen, then it wouldn't have the excuse of having an episode of the Casagrandes sleeping over to the Loud family's place for one night. And this is where you can tell onto why that this episode was made in the first place. It's mainly the Casagrandes spending the night at the Loud's residence until Rosa takes them away. Look, I'm just gonna be saying this right now. This isn't the reason onto why that this episode is a lot more better compared to Raw Deal, because in all honesty, knowing how we're supposed to get used to the Loud siblings and how they should develop over time, the Casagrandes honestly felt like that they're only doing this because their lives, despite being somewhat better compared to the Loud families, doesn't automatically mean that they're mostly crazed free or chaos free. Mainly the fact that they have disabilities and also flaws that honestly overshadows the positives. Like, compared to the Loud family, it's a lot more difficult and a lot more frustrating, considering that they're the characters that we're familiar with since 2016. But when it came to the Casagrandes, even though there were a lot of missed opportunities, it's difficult to hate these characters completely. Like, granted, I'm fully aware that Carla and Sergio are the most unlikable characters, and I understand that the characters in Ryan's school are really unlikable. But the thing is, the reason why I do not hate these characters completely is because they don't hammer in on their unlikable traits, considering that they're only doing it for the sake of their own benefit and their own type of safety rather than listening to the other characters completely. Granted, that can apply to the Loud family, but at the same time, the Casagrandes, even if you may say that it's mostly the Cleveland show, isn't really that terrible and not that frustrating the more you realize that these characters are completely different than the Loud family. Similarities are there, but still a lot more different in a way that isn't as frustrating as the Loud house. So, the only thing that Lincoln and Rosa have in common isn't because they instantly believe in fortune tellers. It's mainly the fact that when someone, or a fortune teller, which Lincoln doesn't do much after this episode, tells them that the future will be devastating, they never think of an alternative way of what the future would have been like without thinking anything devastating. Like, when the Casagrandes try to do something completely different by trying to convince Rosa to think differently, it doesn't work because Rosa just instantly thinks it's basically bad luck all over again, no matter what, and never think of anything differently, which for me personally is something that Rosa instantly has in her system, while Lincoln has in his system is mainly think of something tragically rather than thinking something completely different, while trying to think for himself of what is really right and what shouldn't happen. But that's where this episode loses points, knowing how the future was after this episode. So with that being said, when it comes to cost, even if it may be over the top at points, you need to understand that there wasn't going to be a sequel episode when it comes to cost. Like, what happens in that episode is never going to happen again afterwards. Now, the reason on why Ernesto has been canceling his shows as of late is because he has a pimple on his head, which is why he said that there was bad luck in Great Lake City. You know, as much as I understand of how stupid this is, I'm starting to convince that the reason on why Ernesto is feeling this way is because he never had pimples and he wants to be completely stylized in front of so many people, including Rosa. I mean, I understand that these characters would never act this way in real life, but this isn't one of the worst things I've seen. I mean, it's stupid, but it's also not one of the stupidest things I've ever seen in cartoons. Granted, he also lied about it, but in all honesty, compared to what people have done in the real world when they become famous, Ernesto's reasoning of lying is nowhere as severe compared to what people do in reality. Like, granted, it resulted Ryan's life taking a turn for the worst, but in comparison of Lincoln's bad luck and No Such Luck, I can honestly tell that this episode would definitely win over No Such Luck, no matter what. And the ending of this episode is honestly the most entertaining I had throughout the entire episode. I mean, granted, the characters are being uninterested in this, but when it comes to Rosa, it makes sense. Like, for me personally, the fact that this is literally the only way for the Casagrandes to be free from any bad luck whatsoever, I guess that's literally the only way to be more convincing than how Lincoln is trying to convince his family that he doesn't have bad luck, only for them to be convinced that if he only wears the squirrel suit, they're bad luck free. I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. I would rather be in any other scenario of what the Casagrandes went through in this episode than in No Such Luck in any day of the week. With that being said, it may be shocking to think, but Coast, even if it had the crossover between the Loud House and the Casagrandes, it's not the reason or to why that episode is superior over this. It's the fact that the execution in that episode was a lot oddly better than this because of how this episode was poorly aged due to the later seasons of the Loud House and the flannelization of the characters. Granted, the Casagrandes have went through flannelization, but unlike the Loud family, the flannelization wasn't that completely severe. I'm giving Raw Deal a 5 out of 10, while Coast gets a 6.75 out of 10. But hey, at least Raw Deal gave us the introduction of Thick Cutie, who still doesn't have a name even to this day. Season 1 was really a wild card of the Loud House, wasn't it?